At this point, I suppose one may well ask how this name of Shakespeare became attached to these literary works. Some of them were first published anonymously, so there was no direct record of the author. But about 1598, the plays began to come out regularly under Shakespeare's name. And in 1609, his sonnets were published under Shakespeare's name. So in that way, the name Shakespeare was attached to these works. The most significant development, however, that forever attached the name of Shakespeare to these plays and sonnets was the first folio that was published 7 years after his death in 1623, the first folio. Before that, the plays had been published in what we call quarto versions, but only 18 of them had appeared before his death in that form. And I think this is a fact of enormous significance. If the first folio had not been published in 1623, we would have lost forever the addition to our literary heritage of such great works as You Like It, Macbeth, Twelfth Night, Antony and Cleopatra, and a number of others, because no plays in any other form have ever been found. Shakespeare probably wrote them out with pen and ink, but none of his handwritten material has ever been discovered. And so it must be that the authors of this folio, or the editors of this folio, found his handwritten material that had not been published in quarto form. Actors had them probably, and so forth, and then put them together in this folio. It is too bad, isn't it, that we don't. I think if we only had one play, we could answer this question of who wrote them. The Stratfordians, Anti-Stratfordians, in fact, sometimes argue that Shakespeare himself was illiterate and that his scribbled William Shakespeare, that we have about 4 or 5 of those signatures on legal documents, suggests a person who was just taught to write his name and nothing else. And you might look at that signature sometime. If you go to Stratford, you can see it, and decide for yourself whether that person who wrote that name was illiterate. It was not just the fact, however, that the plays were published as works of Shakespeare. It was what was said in the first folio by the people who contributed to it. And the people who put it together were the actors John Hemming and Henry Condell. And you may remember they received bequests from Shakespeare in his will, written in 1616. And it's interesting to speculate, was there some kind of connection between that act and the fact that they put together the folio? They credited Shakespeare as the author without any question, and they also listed him as an actor, but they did not indicate any of the parts that he played. A third person who contributed to the first folio, and a person who made a very significant addition to it, was the dramatist Ben Jonson. He referred to the writer of these first folio plays as Gentle Shakespeare, and he called him the soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. And he wrote in a later passage the line that I've just quoted, he was not of an age, but for all time. And still later in the first folio, he referred to Shakespeare as the sweet swan of Avon, which seems to put the writer in Stratford, doesn't it? A further evidence of this relationship between the plays and the person who was born in Stratford comes from another contributor to the first folio, whose name was Leonard Digges, D-I-G-G-E-S. And he wrote a poem in that first folio in which he said, when time dissolves thy Stratford monument. He spelled it differently. When time dissolves thy Stratford monument. Well, I said that when Shakespeare died, there was no celebration or recognition of his death, but later, before 1623, a monument was built in Stratford, which you can see today, and he seems to be referring to that monument. Well, now, what are the Anti-Stratfordians going to do with all this evidence? How are they going to refute it? Well, they do have explanations, and I'm going to come back to them a little bit later as we discuss the contenders to the Stratford, to the Shakespeare authorship. Well, if Shakespeare of Stratford couldn't possibly have written the Shakespeare plays and sonnets, who did write them? They obviously didn't spring into existence by spontaneous generation. Some hand was at work. So if you reject Shakespeare, you have to find somebody to take his place. And with that intriguing question, I think I'm going to take a little recess, give you a chance to get some coffee, and think about what I've just said. Just before the recess, I concluded with the question, if Shakespeare of Stratford didn't write the Shakespeare plays, who did? There's a long list of contenders. Somebody has counted 58 who have been proposed as people who wrote the plays. One writer, Gilbert Slater, was a little bit more modest. He wrote a book called The Seven Shakespeares. Well, one of the contenders, and one that was quite prominent some years ago, but I think not quite so prominent now, is Shakespeare's fellow playwright, Christopher Marlowe. However, there's a big problem in suggesting that he wrote the plays, and that is that history records quite definitely, with good evidence, that Christopher Marlowe was killed in a barroom brawl in 1593. That was the date of the first Shakespeare work, Venus and Adonis. So, if you believe that Christopher Marlowe wrote those plays, you have to believe that for some reason he had to hide his identity, that he faked his death and then somewhere went on writing the plays that we now credit to Shakespeare. I think another problem with Marlowe also is that when you read his works, the works that are credited to Marlowe, they are good. They are good. But I don't think they fall anywhere near the Shakespeare standard of excellence. And so you would have to believe then that Marlowe did what Shakespeare did to a degree, that is, that he grew and that he was eventually able to write the plays of the quality that we've been talking about. But I think that takes a large measure of belief to believe that all of this happened and that he went on after 1593 alive and well and wrote the plays. A sort of similar problem is connected with another candidate who's not very well known, the Earl of Rutland. If the dating of the plays is anywhere near correct, he would have had to write some of the greatest works when he was about 5 years old, and that's a little difficult to believe. Other pretenders to the Shakespeare throne are the Earl of Derby, Robert Greene, Thomas Dekker, Anthony Shirley. Some of these I've never heard of really before. Walter Raleigh, we've all heard of him. I suppose in referring to the Shakespeare plays, I should have kept saying his or her works, because at least 3 women have been suggested as the writers. One is the Countess of Pembroke, and yes, Queen Elizabeth I has also been proposed as a possibility. I think one of the weirdest ideas, however, is that a woman named Anne Whately wrote the Shakespeare plays. How did her name get in the running? Well, when the announcement of Shakespeare's marriage to Anne Hathaway was put in the paper, or whatever it was that the clerk's announcement, I guess it was, he was reported to be engaged to somebody named Anne Whately. The next day it was corrected to Anne Hathaway. And what most people who reject Anne Whately believe is that there was another person named William Whately who was dealing with the clerk. And the clerk just got mixed up, and he got Whately's name there where Hathaway should have been. And most conventional scholars believe, and I think I agree with them, that a person named Anne Whately never even existed. And yet she is proposed as one of the possible authors. Well, not much credence is given to the people I've mentioned, with the possible exception of Marlowe. You mentioned to me you were the one, weren't you, that mentioned that there has been a Marlowe Society in Canterbury, England, and she asked me whether I knew of its existence. I confess that I did not, but I suspected it might do any of you happen to know? No, it might very well exist, because Marlowe, I think, has had a good deal of people who support his claim. However, there are 2 contenders, I think, that have had the most prominent place in this controversy. The theory that Francis Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays was first advanced in 1856 by Delia Bacon, who, as far as I know, had no relationship to him. But the idea received its greatest impetus in 1888, when Ignatius Donnelly wrote a 2-volume work that ran well over 1,000 pages, which presented the case for Bacon. And that work is still in our library. It's 2 great big volumes. It unfortunately is suffering from what we read about in the paper Sunday, the deterioration of the paper, and I handled it very carefully because the paper was obviously getting very old. But it's a fascinating book to read. I did not read all 1,000 pages, but I did dip into it. What about the dates? Do they fit Bacon? Yes, they do. They fit Bacon very well. He was born in 1561, 3 years before Shakespeare. He died in 1626, 10 years after Shakespeare's death. He was a member of the aristocracy. He was educated at Cambridge. He was a lawyer. He eventually rose to the post of Lord Chancellor. He traveled extensively. He developed the inductive method of reasoning, one of the great philosophical contributions. He was made a peer when he was made the Viscount of St. Albans. He was familiar with the theater because he wrote some theatrical presentations that were produced at his law school, Gray's Inn, and he hired actors in London to perform in those presentations. And interestingly enough, one of the actors that he might have hired was William Shakespeare of Stratford. He wrote extensively, as we all know, under his own name. The most notable are the 58 essays, which are considered masterpieces of their kind. But his other works are so extensive that they fill 20 volumes.